For your ears only for the week of April 8th, Easter and Passover, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Eddie Robinson.
He has a very different view than I do about the soul of America. You see, I watch him, and I'm convinced that he believes that we should have a government-centered society. And I believe we should maintain America as an opportunity society led by free people and free enterprises.
I'm confident that this will be upheld because it should be upheld. Overturning a law that was passed by a strong majority of a democratically elected Congress.
We have now reached the point where it's halftime. Half the delegates in this process have been selected. And who's ready to charge out of the locker room in Pennsylvania for a strong second half?
After winning all three GOP primaries last week in Wisconsin, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., Mitt Romney was more free than ever to refocus his rhetorical fire on Barack Obama. The president returned the fire, charging the GOP with pitiless social Darwinism. But Obama also opened a strange second front on health care by lecturing what he called the unelected Supreme Court, a term mostly favored by conservatives. And Rick Santorum was still rejecting party pressure to pull out, though even winning his home state of Pennsylvania was looking increasingly doubtful.
And new polling helped set the stage for the fall campaign already taking shape. A USA Today Gallup survey showed Obama with a 9-point advantage over Romney in key swing states, thanks in large part to a heavy lead among women. And the likely GOP nominee wasn't helped by the Republican National Committee chairman, suggesting that party policies on contraception and abortion constituted a war on women, were as fanciful as war on caterpillars. Democrats also had a significant edge with the growing Latino vote and a 2-to-1 advantage among Jewish voters, though a survey on Jewish values showed potential for both candidates. 46% said a commitment to social equality was the most important quality of Jewish identity, versus only 20% who said support for Israel. But a 54% majority also felt that poor people had become too dependent on government aid.
To talk about the refocusing of the presidential campaign for Your Ears Only, we're joined by Boston Globe politics editor Glen Johnson. Welcome to our program.
Oh, thanks for having me on, both of you.
Talk first about the poll in swing states and what you thought were the most important areas of strength for Obama in terms of geography, key demographic groups, and the most salient issues.
Well, I mean, I think that the president has rebounded a little bit over the course of the Republican campaign. I mean, it's a natural. He hasn't had to run through the Democratic gauntlet like he did 4 years ago. And so he's been able to benefit from some of the damage that's been inflicted on Mitt Romney and other members of the Republican field by, the other candidates that they're running against. And so when you see a candidate like him doing better among women, you see candidates like Romney and Santorum lagging in those categories. It's about the way the White House had hoped things would go, that the president would strengthen in comparison to the Republicans, and some of the rhetoric from the primary campaign would weaken them.
Romney last week again played up an overheard Obama comment on nuclear missile defense, suggesting he had a secret agenda for after the election. On the other hand, yet another key Romney supporter said some of his real views would come out after he secured the nomination. To what degree is this issue now neutralized? And to what degree can Romney play etch-a-sketch politics and play to the center without losing a still dubious GOP base?
Well, in a rhetorical sense, it was fascinating to see how fast that etch-a-sketch comment was eclipsed by the president's open mic comment to President Medvedev. And what's been interesting about all this is I frankly, from my perspective, and this is the fifth campaign I've covered, I find it all very overblown, because I think there's always a natural reset in any race when it becomes a general election matchup. A lot of what's said in the primary is forgotten, and with good reason. Because when it gets to a general election matchup, there's only two people in the country that have a chance of becoming president. And in this case, it looks like it's going to be both President Obama either being reelected or Mitt Romney emerging as a Republican nominee. And so that crystallizes everything. That focuses the mind on what are the differences between these two, not what are the differences between Mitt Romney and 8 other candidates for the nomination. I do think that the president's comment is potentially more problematic because it's pretty easy to understand, and it's the kind of argument that I think Mitt Romney would make in a general election. That if you've been afraid of what Barack Obama has done facing the specter of re-election, imagine only what he will do if he doesn't have that hanging over his head anymore.
So you don't buy the idea that the Tea Party has so crystallized in the Republican base that it really would sacrifice winning for ideological purity?
I think that a lot of people say that, and there's a lot of bluster and bravado about that. But I think ultimately when it comes down to, can you imagine a Tea Party candidate voting for President Obama? I can't. I mean, the alternative is for them to stay home. But, I think that the more likely case is that even the most ardent Romney critic who's a Obama opponent is more likely to hold his nose and cast a ballot for Romney in that case.
Indeed, it should be said that some of the polling had showed that Romney was the second choice among all of the supporters of all of the non-Romneys.
Exactly. And I think if you looked at the exit polls in Wisconsin and in Maryland, too, you could see the coalescing around him, strength growing in evangelical support, people picking him as the alternate to all the other candidates, and him winning in both states very strongly. I think over 70% among the voters that said that beating President Obama was their primary criteria for picking a candidate.
What about Romney's vulnerability on job creation and destruction from his private sector days at Bain Capital?
Sure. I mean, the common rap that you hear from him, and you'll hear more again, is that Massachusetts was 47th in job creation when he was governor. I think the more potent line of attack against him, and it was in his 1994 U.S. Senate race, was criticism of how Bain Capital made its millions over the time that he was leading it. There's a lot of success stories in there, Domino's Pizza, Staples, Bright Horizons Child Care Centers, but there's a number of really searing episodes there of companies that were bought, loaded up with heavy debt, and then sold off. And while Bain took out huge profits and huge fees, a lot of people lost their jobs. And Ted Kennedy really marshaled support against him by having some of those workers come and cut ads on behalf of his campaign in 1994. And I expect you'll hear, the similar types of stories in the general election this fall.
How do you explain Obama's remarks about the Supreme Court saying he saw any rejection of his health care reform as unprecedented, as if the judges were really interested in his opinion?
It was pretty stunning commentary from a former con law professor. I mean, I'm a four-year undergraduate. I was a government major, but in my con law class there, the lesson there was that the Constitution says what the Supreme Court says it says. And it's always been an unelected body, and they've always been able to overturn what the Congress does. And law evolves and changes. I mean, we go from Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Education. And for the president to say that, I think, almost tempted the Supreme Court to overturn his health care law. They're supposed to decide it based on those arguments they heard the prior week. But, for a court that's already loaded up against him, that just seemed to be something that would back them into a corner and make them want to, defend their role and their position in the whole government system. I mean, they're a third part of our system.
Glen Johnson is politics editor at the Boston Globe.
Quote from the news, "It's a bad sequel to a bad movie." That was former New York Attorney General and Governor Eliot Spitzer joining criticism of the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, JOBS, signed last week by the president, that eases restriction on investment fundraising. Quote, "It should be called the Bring Fraud Back to Wall Street Act," Spitzer said.
Next, the Syrian standoff, for your ears only.